Now a look at the cost of prescription drugs. We'll hear from representatives of the prescription drug manufacturing industry. The Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee hearing runs about 2 hours.
Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions will please come to order. Senator Murray and I will each have an opening statement, and then we'll introduce the witnesses. After the witnesses' testimony, senators will each have 5 minutes of questions. There's a vote scheduled for 10:30. I think what we'll do is continue right on through until about 10:45. And then we'll alternate going back and forth to vote. I think we'll have time for all of us to hear the witnesses' testimony before we have to leave for the vote. Today we're holding a hearing which is the second in a series on prescription drug costs in response to a bipartisan request led by Senators Cassidy, Senator Franken, along with Senators Collins, Baldwin, Murkowski, Whitehouse, Capito, Sanders, Enzi, and Warren, as well as other senators who are interested in this subject. Not only was the request for these hearings bipartisan, but both this hearing and the first hearing on drug prices were bipartisan, which means Senator Murray and I agreed on the witnesses. Despite this, our first hearing in June went so far off track that I delayed this hearing because senators, instead of talking about drug prices, wanted to use the opportunity to talk about other issues, specifically the Affordable Care Act. I acknowledge their deep feelings and differences of opinions on the ACA, but the Senate has been stuck in a partisan stalemate for 7 years over what is a relatively small part of health care, the individual health insurance market, where 6% of Americans purchase health insurance. Senator Murray and I have been working for several weeks to see if we can find within the Senate a limited consensus bipartisan agreement to stabilize the individual market in the interim. But there are many other issues that have caused health care spending in this country to grow from consuming 9% of the gross domestic product in 1980 to nearly 18% in 2015 and a predicted 20% in 2025, according to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We need to look at all aspects of health care spending. The 15% or so we spend on prescription drugs, including retail and prescription drugs administered in hospitals, and the other 85% of healthcare spending, which includes doctors' visits, surgeries, and medical devices, and ways to get these costs under control. We're having a hearing on Thursday to discuss wellness and healthy lifestyle changes and how they could decrease serious illnesses and bring down healthcare costs. So while, of course, senators are free to say and do whatever they wish to do, I would hope today that we could focus on the cost of prescription drugs while we have these excellent witnesses before us. Next month, the committee will hold a third hearing to hear from Norm Augustine and consider a report he is leading from the National Academy of Sciences. This report is the result of a study called Ensuring Patient Access to Affordable Drug Therapies. We've set a good example of bipartisan success in the Food and Drug Administration user fee agreements for 18 months. This committee worked with our counterparts in the House to update and pass user fee agreements. They included provisions from many senators on both sides of the aisle, including measures that will provide additional staff and resources to the FDA to approve more biosimilars and generic drugs, which provide more competition and lower drug costs. That bill became law this summer. Last year, the committee worked together on 21st century cures to spur the development of new drugs and treatments. My goal for these hearings is to continue these in a bipartisan way and learn the facts about what goes into the price patients pay when picking up their prescriptions and what, if any, steps we can agree on to lower those prices. We're in the middle of a remarkable time in science. It's producing amazing discoveries for patients. We have drugs that can cure hepatitis C, keep cancer at bay, and stop a stroke. With this innovation comes new challenges. We need to make sure all patients can benefit. We've all heard from patients that the cost of new drugs are often too much for them to afford. We also need to make sure that any action we take doesn't jeopardize the innovation and the breakthroughs. The prescription drug delivery system, how a drug gets from the manufacturer to the patient, is complicated. More than 4.4 billion prescriptions are written for drugs each year for Americans who then pick up these prescriptions at 60,000 drugstores or receive them from doctors or hospitals or online pharmacies. And those 4.4 billion prescriptions, estimated to cost $450 billion, are paid for in a similarly complicated way, which you're going to hear about today. In addition to private insurance, many different government programs subsidize or pay for prescription drugs. Medicaid, 340B, Medicare Part B and Part D, TRICARE, VA, and the Indian Health Service. Patients often pay a set amount called a copay or a percentage called coinsurance when picking up their prescription as well. Or sometimes patients have to cover the whole cost if they haven't met their deductible. What amount of the cost of the prescription drug they pay is determined by what health insurance they may have. I hope our witnesses today will help us understand the drug delivery system and how their role in the system affects the price patients pay. Our witnesses represent the brand manufacturers who take enormous risk, generic drug manufacturers who over the last 30 years have grown to make up 89% of all prescriptions, lowering costs, drug wholesalers who purchase drugs from manufacturers and deliver them all over the country daily, pharmacy benefit managers who use their buying power to leverage lower prices on all drugs, but also make difficult decisions about drugs to offer patients at what cost and with what copays or what insurance, and then, of course, pharmacists who are on the front lines of helping patients that find out the cost of their medicines when picking it up at the drugstore and having to make that fit within their budgets. As we look at and hope to address the fundamental costs of health care, I hope we can continue to do this in a bipartisan way. Senator Murray.
Well, thank you, Chairman Alexander, for your leadership in holding these hearings, and to all of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their commitment to address this critical challenge before us today, which is the increasing burden and soaring prices of prescription drugs. Much like our last hearing on the devastation being caused by the opioid crisis, this is truly an urgent discussion. Like everyone here, I've heard from so many families who are forced to choose between some high-priced medication and paying their bills, between filling a prescription or putting food on the table, and between getting the care that they need or paying their mortgage or putting gas in the tank. So this is clearly a challenge we need to meet, and meet it quickly. Fortunately, we have taken some steps in the right direction. I'm very pleased this committee worked to increase transparency and foster more competition in the generic drug market in the FDA Reauthorization Act. In these agreements, taking suggestions from both sides, we were able to accelerate the review of generics that can alleviate anti-competitive markets, improve the process for bringing a generic to market by increasing communication and transparency between the FDA and manufacturers, encourage new generics to compete with sole source products vulnerable to price hikes and shortages, and prevent gaming of the Orphan Drug Act, which has brought hope to so many patients. But as we know, generic competition alone will not address the high prices paid by so many patients and families in out-of-pocket costs and high premiums. We've got to make more progress to get at the root of the problem facing patients, which is the high prices set by drug manufacturers. That is why I'm glad Democrats have put forward a number of ideas and legislation to demand more transparency from pharmaceutical companies about what's behind drug prices, allow Medicare to negotiate fair prices for prescription drugs, prevent manufacturers from engaging in price gouging, and crack down on the various anti-competitive practices that keep prices high. These measures would make a real difference when it comes to bringing down prices. Now, all this requires, and I've said it many times, this administration has to be our partner, not a hindrance to our efforts. As we all saw last week, President Trump continued to take unilateral steps to increase premiums and undermine protections for people with pre-existing conditions and cause chaos in our healthcare system. That pattern of governing by sabotage is reckless and appalling, and only makes it, I believe, more critical that Congress shows patients and families we can work together to undo the damage being caused and move on to actually doing some good when it comes to families' health care. On drug prices, Like so many other issues, President Trump talks a big game on Twitter, but has not taken any action to actually lower drug prices. And the little we have seen from this administration, a leaked executive order back in July, barely scratches the surface. Instead, many of the plans that have come out would do very little to actually target drug prices. And in fact, some have actually targeted vital programs like 340B that support hospitals and clinics in serving the very communities who cannot afford the drugs they need to stay healthy. So I hope the administration chooses a different path. And I would just note, by the way, that President Trump could start by nominating a Secretary of Health and Human Services who will put families first when it comes to prescription drug prices and any issues. And I expect a thorough and rigorous nomination process when that comes before us. They have a very important role to play. So we have a lot to cover today, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us. We are very much looking forward to your testimony, and I just want to again thank Chairman Alexander, all of our colleagues, for their efforts to tackle this pressing challenge to make sure prescription medication and life-saving treatments are not just available, but accessible and affordable. And I'm hopeful that our bipartisan work on insurance market stabilization and VDARA can lay the groundwork for serious actions on drug prices, given we all agree this is a priority. As we know, patients and families we serve can't wait much longer. So thank you, everyone, and I turn it back over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Murray, and thank you for creating a bipartisan environment where we can work ahead, as you indicated, on trying to stabilize the individual health insurance market and begin to move away from health insurance to the larger issues affecting health care, such as drug prices. We thank the witnesses for coming. I'd ask you each to summarize your comments in about 5 minutes, and that will leave senators more time to ask questions. The first witness is Lori Riley, the Executive Vice President of Policy, Research, and Mentorship at Pharma. She leads Policy and Research Department there, a trade association of brand drug manufacturers. Chip Davis is the President and Chief Executive of the trade association that represents generic drug manufacturers, distributors, and suppliers. Elizabeth Gallina is Senior Vice President for Government Affairs and General Counsel, representing prescription drug wholesalers. Welcome to you. Mark Merritt is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the national group that represents America's pharmacy benefit managers. And Thomas Monegan is the Executive Director and Chief Executive of the largest association of pharmacists in the United States. So, Ms. Riley, let's begin with you, and then we'll hear from each witness.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Alexander, Ranking Murray, and members of the committee for having me here today. Over the past 20 years, the Food and Drug Administration has approved more than 500 new medicines to market, and those have resulted in significant progress against some of our nation's most costly and challenging conditions. Through innovation, the HIV/AIDS death rate has dropped 86% in this country from the mid-90s. And more recently, progress that has been making in the space of oncology have been heralded as game changers for many patients facing serious conditions such as cancer. Today, because of scientific advances, many other conditions are now manageable and sometimes even curable. In the midst of the incredible scientific progress that we've seen, drug spending growth is actually declining from its peak in 2014. In fact, last year, prescription drug spending cost growth was 3 to 5%, according to public and private experts. That was in line with all other forms of spending growth. And spending on retail as well as physician-administered drugs continues to remain about 14% of what we spend in terms of total healthcare dollars in this country. Now, oftentimes when people talk about that 14%, there's a presumption that all of that comes back to the brand name manufacturer. In fact, less than half of that 14%, about 6.8% of what we spend on total healthcare in this country, comes back to the brand name industry. The rest goes to the generic industry and others in the supply chain. One important part of the supply chain that isn't with us here today is the hospital sector. Just this morning, we released a paper that looked at the 20 of the most commonly prescribed expensive medicines in hospital outpatient settings and found that on average, hospitals increase and are reimbursed 2.5 times the acquisition cost in which they purchase medicines in this country. They're an important part of the supply chain, and I hope we talk about them more later today. Going forward over the next decade, medicines are projected to remain a stable share of healthcare spending at around 14%. Now, to many, they question, how can that possibly be the case? We know what's in the pipeline. We know that over the next 10 years, we're likely to have 40 to 45 new medicines approved every single year. But the reality is we have, for pharmaceuticals, some of the most stringent cost containment across the entire healthcare sector. Pharmacy benefit managers use the fact that there's a great deal of competition within therapeutic areas to limit formularies, to place medicines on high cost-sharing tiers, and to use a host of utilization management techniques to keep costs under control. Over the next 5 years, over $100 billion worth of medicines will be coming off patent, and those medicines will become generics and cheaper for Americans to be able to afford. And importantly, in the pharmaceutical benefit manager space, about 3 pharmacy benefit managers today buy on behalf of 75% of all prescriptions in this country. Because of the leverage that they can exert, in 2015, they were able to secure over $100 billion in rebates and discounts. Now, unfortunately, what's happening today is those rebates and discounts often are not making their way back to patients at point of sale. Compounding this problem is today an increasing number of patients have high cost sharing for their medicines, either because they have a deductible. Today, 50% of commercially insured patients have a deductible for their medicine. When they have a deductible for their medicine, they're asked to pay a list price, in other words, a non-negotiated price for their medicine. There are solutions that we think could be put forth to address some of the cost challenges we face. The first one is the fact that the $100 billion of discounts and rebates should find its way back to patients at the retail pharmacy level. Those discounts should be passed back to patients to lower their health care costs. We also need to do more to reform government rules around how companies can contract today. There's a desire to move our healthcare system towards contracting towards value, but today, because of government rules and regulations, it makes it harder to have sensible contracting. Third, we need to look at programs like the 340B program, which, yes, do provide a very important benefit to many, but as I mentioned before, we know in the hospital sector, oftentimes hospitals are increasing the price of their medicine 2.5 to 3.5 times and are getting reimbursed, oftentimes, again, 3 times as much as the manufacturer is getting reimbursed for the medicine. And last, we need to speed the approval of new medicines as well as generic medicines to the marketplace. Competition is the best medicine to lowering costs over the long term, and we need to build on the work that this committee passed as part of PDUFA 6 to continue to modernize the Food and Drug Administration to have efficient and safe delivery of new medicines and new generic medicines. Future progress is needed, and patients are waiting for the kind of innovation our sector can deliver. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Riley. Mr. Davis, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Alexander, Ranking Member Murray, and members of the committee. I very much appreciate the invitation to testify here today. The Association for Accessible Medicines is the nation's leading trade association for manufacturers of FDA-approved generic prescription drugs. Our members actually manufacture more than 90% of all the generic pharmaceuticals dispensed in the United States, providing tens of thousands of jobs in over 150 facilities throughout the country, and manufacture more than 61 billion doses of medication every year here in the United States. AAM's core mission is to improve the lives of patients by advancing timely access to affordable generic and biosimilar medications. On behalf of our members, let me begin by thanking the committee for convening today's hearing to examine the critical challenge of rising drug prices and for your leadership in reauthorizing all the user fee programs earlier this year, most particularly for our interests, the generic and biosimilar user fee programs. Generic medicines currently represent, as the chairman said, almost 90%, actually 89% of all prescriptions dispensed in the U.S. But importantly, we account for only 26% of all expenditures on prescription drugs, saving patients and payers nearly $5 billion every week. Last year, use of generic medicines saved $253 billion to the U.S. healthcare system. That translates into meaningful patient access. Generics actually operate currently in a deflationary market, not an inflationary market, and that is an important context. Consider that in the past 12 months, prescriptions of brands have gone down by 7%, while their revenue has increased slightly. By contrast, generic prescriptions have actually gone up. They're up 2% year over year, while revenue has declined by 13%. It is easy to recognize the significant difference between generic and brand name prescription drugs when it comes to prices that we often see at the pharmacy counter. The dramatic difference, however, in how brand and generic drug markets operate is not as widely understood. When generics enter to provide competition to a brand monopoly, payers typically shift away from the rebate model of reimbursement that you often hear about and rely on distribution channels to effectively lower the price of medicine. Generics therefore compete for sales, and because the products are identical, commonly the only leverage that generic manufacturers have is their ability to lower price and guarantee volume. This creates fierce competition in the marketplace amongst our members, which in turn causes prices to decline. So the reality is that the markets for brands and generics are very different, monopolized versus commoditized, and these differences create vastly different incentives for all the stakeholders in the supply chain. This reality was most recently examined and affirmed through a report issued by the University of Southern California Center for Health Policy and Economics entitled "The Flow of Money Through the Pharmaceutical Distribution System." Among the findings was that supply chain stakeholders capture significantly more revenue spent on generics than they do on brands. In fact, for every $100 spent on dispensing a generic medicine in this country, approximately $65 goes to the distribution and reimbursement of those products by members of the supply chain. In today's market, consolidation in the wholesaler and distributor market and arrangements between pharmacy chains and distributors have left generic manufacturers with a very small number of very large-scale purchasers. Essentially, 3 purchasers today account for 90% of all sales from all generic manufacturers. Ultimately, a market that has 3 large-scale purchasers is going to see significant compression and consolidation on the supply side, which is our side. Fewer generic manufacturers running the risk of marketing smaller portfolios can easily translate into less competition, not more, while simultaneously increasing the risk of drug shortages, a scenario none of us want to see happen. As this committee has identified and reflected in the title of this hearing, how do these realities affect what patients pay, and what does it mean for them moving forward? So we all know 30 years ago, Hatch-Waxman created a remarkably strong system designed to balance innovation and access. But that system can only function if there is robust competition amongst buyers and sellers. And that system can only work if generic companies can get the drug samples they need to do the pharmacovigilance and start the FDA application and approval process, which this committee has spearheaded efforts to accelerate and reform. And that system only works when generic medicines have the ability to enter the market when patents and other IP protections are actually supposed to expire. And ultimately, that system works when public policy doesn't favor one side of the access and innovation equation at the expense of the other. In closing, we all know that something must be done about prescription drug prices. Given the fact that new FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb has characterized drug costs as a public health concern, AEM respectfully submits that Congress has the opportunity to consider policies that will enhance generic and biosimilar competition. We have provided those in our written testimony, and I look forward to answering your questions as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Ms. Gallina, welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Alexander, Ranking Member Murray, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. I'm Liz Gallina, Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the Healthcare Distribution Alliance. HDA is the national trade association representing primary pharmaceutical wholesale distributors. HDA members include national, regional, and specialty companies. Their expertise streamlines the supply chain to ensure safety and efficiency, serving over 200,000 pharmacy settings across the country while achieving cost savings for our nation's healthcare system, about $40 billion annually. The U.S. healthcare supply chain is a complex one. Each day, our 35 primary distributor members who purchase directly from authorized manufacturers ship 15 million products daily from about 176 warehouses across the country, a relatively small but highly efficient and effective network. In fact, most pharmaceutical sales in the U.S. flow through our members, nearly 94%. Distributors are unlike any other supply chain participants. Their core business is not manufacturing, and they do not prescribe medicines or dispense to patients. They focus significant resources on the safety and security of the supply chain. And these efforts may, in fact, be the most important service distributors provide. With this committee's support several years ago, HDA strongly advocated for the enactment of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which sets the framework for unit-level traceability of medicines by 2023. On a daily basis, pharmacies and other providers place orders with HDA distributors for the medicines they need to serve their patients. Without distributors, customers would have to carry weeks of inventory and place daily orders with each and every manufacturer. By working with full-line distributors, providers can maintain just-in-time inventories, saving them time, expense, and staff necessary to carry extensive inventories or have large storage facilities. In addition, primary distributors often provide financial credit terms, pharmacy management systems, and in-store resale support. With regard to the upstream supply chain, the work of HDA members enables manufacturers to concentrate on developing and producing medicines without the added expense and challenge of getting those medicines to every single dispensing site across the country. While HDA members are primarily supply chain logistics and operations experts, this is no longer an industry focused solely on moving products from point A to point B. Today, they provide a wide array of supporting services that deliver significant value to both ends of the supply chain and ultimately to patients. Some examples of these core services to manufacturers include receiving and accurately processing orders, shipping pharmaceutical products safely, inventory management, providing manufacturers with ordering and utilization data, and processing returns and chargebacks. In exchange for these services provided to manufacturers, distributors charge bona fide service fees. These fees are not passed on to the customer and represent a fair market value for a bona fide itemized service actually performed on behalf of the manufacturer that the manufacturer would have to otherwise perform themselves. The distribution industry is a very high volume yet very low profit margin industry, with the industry margin just over 1% on average for 2016. Moreover, a recent Berkeley Research Group study noted that the distributor profit on overall branded drug costs was just under 1%. Distributors have little impact on overall drug pricing, and generally, traditional pharmaceutical distributors purchase from manufacturers based on wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC, and charge manufacturers service fees. WAC represents the manufacturer's list price, does not include rebates, prompt payments, or other adjustments in price resulting from proprietary negotiations between the manufacturers and distributors, payer groups, or other customers. Distributors are not privy to how such WAC pricing decisions are made. On the other side of the equation, distributors typically sell branded drugs to downstream customers based on WACs established solely by manufacturers. They also sell generic drugs to downstream customers based on either WACs or other list prices, or they may also price generic drugs sold to customers in response to the market, for example, when there are more than one generic drugs. As such, wholesale distributors do not control the price of prescription drugs, but rather pick prices dictated by manufacturers' WAC or other list prices, as well as market forces, including generic competition. Primary distributors' goal for the supply chain is a simple one: add efficiency, security, timely delivery, so that providers can concentrate on patient care and ensure that their patients have access to the medicines they need. Historically, HDA distributor members have had a positive effect on the supply chain, helping to make the U.S. supply chain one of the safest and most efficient in the world, while taking costs out of the system and having minimal impact on the overall cost of drugs. Thank you, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Gallina. Mr. Merritt, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for inviting me to discuss drug pricing and the delivery system drug makers use to bring their products to market. I'd like to start by providing a brief top-line overview of a very complicated subject, an executive summary, if you will, on why there's such anger about drug pricing, especially now, the role supply chains play, and how PBMs use their scale and expertise to reduce overall costs. There are several reasons why drug pricing has become such a concern in recent years. First is drug makers' recent shift from producing blockbuster drugs like Lipitor, which may have cost $3 a day, to drugs like Sovaldi, which cost $1,000 a day. These are great drugs, but not everybody is prepared to pay $1,000 a day for a new drug, even if it is a great drug. All this came on the heels of a decade that saw very little brand inflation, thanks to a wave of competing generics that hit the market at that time. The second reason for concern were the recent high-profile scandals involving 3 drug makers, specifically Mylan's 400% EpiPen price hike, and the discovery that two companies, Turing and Valiant, had built entire business models around buying rights to low-cost drugs in order to resell them at much higher prices. There were, of course, many hearings on the issues, and I testified at a few of them. Third is that many health plans have tried to restrain premium increases by raising deductibles in the face of higher costs, not just of drugs, but of overall major medical costs. Higher deductibles meant that some patients who'd grown accustomed to paying $25 copays, thinking that might actually be the price of the drug, came face to face for the first time with the actual price of drugs, which can run hundreds or even thousands of dollars. So the rise of high-priced specialty drugs, the scandals surrounding particular manufacturers, and the emergence of high-deductible plans have converged all at one time to raise real visibility on this issue. Now I'd like to offer just a few brief thoughts on the drug supply chain. First, supply chains are a routine part of how consumers access not just drugs, but almost any product in the marketplace. They're a normal part of American business. They are not something that's unique to prescription drugs or healthcare. They are used all across America. It should be noted that supply chains have nothing to do with why manufacturers raise prices. Mylan didn't raise EpiPen prices by 400% because of supply chain costs. The laws of supply and demand, not supply chains, determine how drug makers and other manufacturers set prices. In its simplest terms, the prescription drug marketplace is like any other, a market of sellers and buyers. Drug makers are the sellers, and like all sellers, set prices according to whatever the market will bear. Likewise, the buyers want to pay as little as possible. These are the employers, unions, health plans, and government programs that hire PBMs to negotiate price concessions from drug makers. In fact, PBMs do a number of things to reduce costs. PBMs design benefits that encourage patients to use generics and less expensive brands. PBMs create networks of affordable pharmacies that reduce costs for consumers. PBMs negotiate rebates and other price concessions from drug companies. It should be noted that rebates are simply discounts paid after sales have been made instead of at the point of sale. While PBMs have stated publicly that we welcome drug companies to offer alternatives to rebates, including simply lowering the list price of drugs, rebates remain a key way to deliver savings to our clients who determine the amount of rebates each PBM passes through to them. 90% of rebates are passed through to plan sponsors, and almost half of large employers require 100% of rebates to be passed through. Once these are passed through, plans can decide what to do with them. Typically, they're used to reduce premiums, deductibles, copays, but that's up to every plan to do what they want. So the marketplace is evolving on the issue. It should also be noted that drug makers set and raise prices regardless of rebates they negotiate with PBMs. In fact, Sovaldi's list price was $84,000 and involved no rebate whatsoever until other competitors came to market. Then we were able to bring prices and costs way down. In fact, lower than a lot of price-controlled countries in Europe. All in all, PBMs reduce drug costs by 30%, play a major role in the success of Medicare Part D, and have helped restrain the growth in overall drug spending to 3 to 4% a year, despite rising list prices. Finally, there are market-based policy solutions that can reduce costs. I'd like to thank Senators Collins and Franken for their FDA reauthorization amendment to expedite generic approvals, promote competition, and guard against sudden price hikes of decades-old drugs. We also urge Congress to work with FDA to accelerate approvals for brand drugs which face limited competition and to do whatever possible to bring biosimilars to market faster. These steps would foster competition, which is the key to reducing overall drug prices. I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. Mr. Monegan.
Thank you, Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Murray, for the opportunity to discuss a very important topic for our nation's patients, families, and pharmacists. It's an honor to be here. I'm Tom Monegan, American Pharmacists Association CEO. APHA is America's largest, oldest, and most diverse pharmacist organization. We promote patient access and coverage for pharmacist quality patient care services. Our members contribute to health care in a wide variety of settings, including physician offices, specialty and community pharmacies, both chain and independent, senior care, ambulatory care, and health systems. For many years as a practicing community pharmacist and specialty pharmacy owner, I've shared the challenges with patients facing financial choices between food and medicine. Today's topic is of concern to America's 300,000 pharmacists, the professional on the front line informing patients about medication costs and explaining complex insurance coverage policies. As the organization representing pharmacists in all practice settings, we support policies that increase patients' access to affordable and cost-effective medicines. Decisions among the entire supply chain impact patient medication costs, including arrangements among manufacturers, wholesalers, insurers, and PBMs. Pharmacies are where millions of Americans are first confronted with complex pharmaceutical pricing policies or changes in coverage, formularies, prior authorization, deductibles, co-payments, many of which they don't know or understand. Upstream decisions often limit pharmacists' options to impact patients' final drug costs. Instead of helping to address the nearly $300 billion the U.S. spends annually on medication use problems, fixing the problems of medication use, community pharmacists spend much of their day on the phone pursuing appropriate, covered, affordable treatment. To address this challenge, we support a transparent pricing framework that would eliminate or identify mechanisms like rebates and post-point-of-sale price fees imposed on pharmacies. These policies generally result in higher point-of-sale prices to consumers and, consequently, higher beneficiary co-payments. We also encourage policies that allow any willing pharmacy to enter into contracts with insurers or PBMs to increase patient access and choice, which can improve adherence and health outcomes. APHA requests the committee to look beyond the drug price spend in isolation. Policies should consider the relationship between effective medication use and lower medical costs rather than scoring them in silos. Full value in healthcare will come from integrating these silos and their related costs and outcomes. As drugs become more expensive, complex, and personalized, the need to optimize their impact and value should increase. To get the greatest benefit from medications, patients must understand how to use their medications safely and effectively. Empowered pharmacists can assist patients in optimizing the medication use and decreasing patient costs by providing services focused on safe and appropriate use. For example, pharmacists provide medication management services, especially important for patients who take multiple drugs or have chronic conditions. And we address hospital readmissions by helping patients transition between care settings. Unfortunately, Medicare does not cover our services. Many of our nation's seniors are medically underserved, despite 91% of Americans living within 5 miles of a community pharmacy. Pharmacists are well-trained and underutilized healthcare resource, which can positively affect beneficiaries' care and the entire Medicare program. We ask your support today for S-109, the Pharmacy and Medically Underserved Areas Enhancement Act, and urge its swift passage to provide access to underserved seniors. Not only will access increase, but the Act will help improve beneficiary outcomes, particularly those impacted by medications. But we have to be on the team. Finally, APHA supports a safe and secure supply chain. America's pharmacists and patients should not have to worry about diversion and counterfeits. We believe proposals to legalize importation of non-FDA-approved drugs will do more harm than good. Importantly, we have great concern regarding importation's impact on patient safety and continuity of care. We believe it is in direct conflict with recent efforts by Congress to secure the U.S. supply chain and secure and improve patient safety. In summary, thank you for including pharmacists today, the medication experts on the patient's healthcare team in this discussion. Ultimately, the most expensive medicine is the one not purchased, not taken, abandoned, or not used correctly by patients. Pharmacists stand ready to help. I look forward to answering any questions on the positive role we can play and do play in reducing patients' prescription drug costs. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the witnesses. We'll now begin a 5-minute round of questions. I'll begin, then we'll go to Senator Murray, and then we'll leave and go vote and come back. But we'll continue the hearing so that senators can ask questions. Ms. Riley, did I hear you right? I think you said that 3 of the pharmacy benefit managers, which Mr. Merritt represents, negotiate rebates for 75% of prescriptions sold?
That's correct.
And that's about $100 billion of money?
In 2015, over $100 billion was negotiated on behalf of commercial health plans as well as some government-mandated.
And a rebate is simply that $100 billion means that the pharmacy benefit managers then, the manufacturers get less money.
Correct.
Pharmacy benefit managers then decide in their negotiations where that $100 billion goes.
Right, so it lowers the net price to the manufacturer. That money either gets sent back to the insurance company, some of which is kept, a portion of which is kept by the pharmacy benefit manager.
Mr. Monegan, you said, I believe, that we don't need rebates. Is that what you said?
No, what I said was that
Want to get rid of them?
we need more transparency in the system so that we know where they're coming from.
Yeah.
You know, at the end of the day, when a patient walks up to a pharmacy and the pharmacy presents them with the cost of the medicine to them, the impact of rebates isn't really felt until after.
Yeah, well, Ms. Riley was saying that people who go into your pharmacies don't really see the direct, or don't necessarily see the direct benefit of the rebate negotiated by the pharmacy.
Well, that's fair, they don't.
Managers. And Senator Murray and I and others of us, we've been working on health insurance, which we find to be very complicated. Where the money goes in prescription drugs is more complicated. I've yet to figure out exactly where it goes. Why do we need rebates at all? I mean, wouldn't it increase transparency if the drug manufacturers just established a list price and then they negotiated with the pharmacy benefit managers or whomever else they sold to a reduction in that price if they wanted to, and then we wouldn't have some mystery about who's getting the benefit of a rebate?
Without commenting on the need for rebates, they're clearly used to drive market share.
Why wouldn't you comment on it?
They're used to drive market share. Oftentimes, in our view, that's not necessarily to the benefit of the patient. When pharmacists are trying to manage medication use.
My question is, why do we need rebates?
Well, I would
I don't know
argue
why we need rebates.
Mr. Merritt, why do we need rebates? Why don't we just get rid of rebates and let you negotiate directly with the manufacturers, take that $100 billion a year and just reduce the list price, and then wouldn't that make it simpler for us to understand where the money goes?
We'd be open to that. I mean, rebates were around before PBMs ever came on the scene. And usually rebates are used not just by manufacturers of drugs, but other products because they want to keep one high price because their lower volume clients will pay that price. But then as they have bigger volume clients, instead of lowering the price, they'll offer a bigger discount, which is all a rebate is.
I would argue, though, that high rebates are things that both the pharmacy benefit managers and insurance companies like, because they get a big check at the end of the day for those rebates. Yeah. They then can use those rebate dollars to do what they want to do with them, which is typically to lower premiums.
Would you like, Ms. Riley, to eliminate rebates?
We'd like to see those rebates get passed back to the patient at the point of sale.
Why worry about a big complicated chart that shows how they're being passed back? Why not just eliminate rebates?
Well, I think that's one option, obviously, to have a lower list price. But I will tell you today, plans and PBMs tend to favor products in terms of the formularies. They prefer to have a product with a high list price and a high rebate because, again, that money flows back to them for them to decide what to do with.
Ms. Gallo, what do you think? Do we need rebates at all?
Honestly, to be candid, wholesale distributors don't have any role in this rebate.
But you have a nice view of the prescription drug business. Do you think it'd be more transparent and easier to follow and consumers might get a more direct benefit of lower costs if rebates were eliminated?
I think it's something to be explored.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. We're exploring it here, trying to get it in. Mr. Davis, what about you?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just this is a good example of a difference between the branded and the generic market. Historically, the rebate model isn't applied across the entire generic sector. Our work in setting a wholesale acquisition cost is generally directly to the wholesalers. We'll have 20 or 25 generic manufacturers competing for the business of the 3 wholesalers. That usually leads to sort of an upfront negotiation with them on price, which is what forces the deflationary aspect of the industry. We are seeing an increased level of involvement between PBMs and brands as branded products come close to patent expiry in an effort to maintain market share that will negatively inhibit a generic getting to market. But ultimately, the rebate model is not as commonly used in the generic side as it is on the brand side.
Thanks to each of you. Senator Murray.
Thank you. Ms. Riley, let me start with you. Do you agree that our current system of brand and generic drugs is designed to strike a careful balance between protecting the market share of innovative drugs for a limited period to recoup costs and driving competition to bring prices down after that time? Yes or no?
I do believe that's the intent of our system, yes.
Well, I do too, but here's what my concern is. Your member companies are taking some actions now to deliberately disrupt that balance to get the longest market monopoly possible in order to benefit their bottom line. And I'll give you some examples. AbbVie recently settled in court to extend the market monopoly for Humira for 20 years. Biogen extended its monopoly on the MS drug Tecfidera to 15 years by getting additional patents that cover only the drug's dosage amount. Allergen sold its patent for Restasis to the Mohawk Indian tribe to shield it from challenge, protecting a more than 15-year monopoly, and recently settled with a generic challenger to keep it off the market for 7 years. So are those isolated incidents, or are they part of a larger trend in which companies use the patent system to actually block competition that could actually bring down prices?
Well, those were a lot of examples. Let me try and address each one of them. In the case of patent settlements, companies are given patents by the Patent and Trademark Office, and they believe they have every right to defend those patents in the court of law. In the case of the AbbVie and Amgen patent settlement you mentioned, there was no exchange of money for that patent settlement. The patents on that particular product, according to public records, exceeded actually to 2033, so this product will be coming on the market 10 years prior to when the patents truly expire for that product. I understand there are other companies that are also trying to get on the market to challenge that particular product. So yes, we have a system, and that system was in part designed by the Hatch-Waxman Act to encourage generic manufacturers to get on the market before our patents actually expire. I think it's a system that's worked incredibly well. In 1984, there were 19% of prescriptions that are generic. Today, nearly 90% of prescriptions are generic. Patent settlements is one way, oftentimes, to get products to market well before the patent would actually have expired. So, you know, oftentimes there are anecdotes pointed out. I would argue that by and large, patent settlements and the Hatch-Waxman system have served and inured to the benefit of patients in getting those medicines to market sooner than they would have been otherwise.
Okay, well, Mr. Davis, I'd like you to comment on that. And there also seems that, as well as I think there's other tactics at play to keep drug prices high. When Congress actually passed the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act as part of the ACA, it cleared the path for products to compete with pricey biologics. The CBO estimated that increased competition could save patients and families $7 billion just through 2019. But even though FDA has now approved several of those, we aren't seeing any great savings. So why is that? And combine it with an answer to the first question.
Senator Murray, thank you for the question. I think there are three things that are having an enormous impact on the generic side of the pharmaceutical ecosystem right now that, quite frankly, are threatening its continued viability and sustainability moving forward. One is the market imbalance that I talked about, and quite frankly, that was created in the market, and it's going to take some time for the market to work that out, where you have essentially three buyers that are in control of 90% of the generic drug supply. The two others, though, are directly related to policy and your question. The second is that there have been a series, both here in Washington at the state level, of what we would call well-intentioned but misguided policy provisions. For instance, things that look to actually penalize generic manufacturers operating in a deflationary market that are only 26% of the total cost, but that are not focusing on the increasing costs of branded drugs and specialty drugs year over year. The implementation of a Medicaid rebate penalty on generics passed as part of the 2015 budget agreement is a great example of that, in addition to some bills in places like Maryland and California on the state legislative side. Directly to your question, the third area is we are absolutely unequivocally seeing an increased effort on the part of certain branded manufacturers with respect to the amount of anti-competitive behavior designed to keep generics and biosimilars off the market. You mentioned a number of them. I think the reality is overall, the reason that we're seeing this is because there are companies that are doing the business math and the political math and thinking that they can actually get away with it. To your question on the biosimilars, interestingly enough, when BPCIA passed as part of the Affordable Care Act, I believe the federal government began scoring estimated savings as early as fiscal year 2014. To your point, the first biosimilar did not get to market until September of 2015. 7 have been approved. Only 3 are on the market. The other 4 are tied up in litigation.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just think it's really real that in order for competition to bring down costs, we have to make sure the market's actually working. So, you know, that's one of the concerns that I have as we move forward.
In the absence of other senators, I'll ask a question, and when they come back, I'll defer to them. With the exception of drugs compounded in pharmacies, each drug sold in the pharmaceutical drug sold in the United States and requires a careful review by the Food and Drug Administration before that drug can be sold in the United States. We call that the FDA gold standard. There are 4.4 billion prescriptions a year. Most of us, when we go into our local pharmacy or the doctor's office, don't really worry about the safety of those prescriptions because we rely on the FDA gold standard. Sometimes when the cost of drugs comes up, there are proposals that we should import drugs from other countries and sidestep the careful FDA review and approval of each drug sold in the United States. I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Mr. Monegan and then going across, whether you agree that we should allow drugs approved by other countries to be sold in the United States without careful review and approval of each drug by the Food and Drug Administration. Mr. Monegan?
The short answer is absolutely not. While APHA appreciates congressional efforts to address patients' medication costs, we don't believe importation is a solution to the complex issue of drug pricing. Broadened importation of non-FDA approved meds threatens patient safety, directly conflicts with congressional efforts to increase the integrity and security of the supply chain and the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, and disrupts continuity of care and value-based payment and delivery. We're concerned that savings, if any, will be short-term and importation will instead result in long-term costs to patients.
Thank you. Mr. Merritt?
I'll give the short answer. We'd oppose that.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. Ms. Galina?
We would absolutely oppose importation as it would threaten patient safety in this country. We have done a lot of work on the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. We're currently in the implementation phase 1 of that law. One of the things that it requires is serialized product by all manufacturers in this country. There is no global standard for serialization currently. It also involves data exchange for each transaction that happens from the manufacturer to distributor to pharmacy by 2023 at the unit level. There is also no global standard for that data exchange. We've done a lot of work to try and protect the U.S. supply chain and make it as safe as possible. And we don't think that allowing foreign imports will do anything to keep that level of security. And
Senator Collins has returned, and I'm going to turn the chair over to her, but I'd like for Mr. Davis and Ms. Riley to answer my question about drug importation.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, briefly, we share the concern that you've heard from the other witnesses here today relative to safety. The Secretary of Health and Human Services has the opportunity to certify and legalize importation if they determine, whether it's a Republican or Democratic health official, that it's safe and cost effective. No one's been willing to do that. I will tell you also there's an additional element related to generics from a practical perspective, which is far and away as a market basket. Generics are less expensive in the U.S. market than they are in major developed markets across the world. So it would beg the question, why would you want to be importing something that's more expensive to begin with?
Ms. Riley?
I would just add on to what my panelists have said previously, but opening our borders to potentially counterfeit medicines risks the health and safety of Americans. Counterfeiting medicines is a low-penalty, low-risk enterprise, and if we open the borders, we are subjecting Americans to unsafe medicine. So we adamantly oppose.
Thank you for your response. First of all, let me say that I love having the gavel in my hand, even if it's only temporarily and because of the need of other members to go vote. I went and voted early so that I could relieve Senator Alexander so the chairman could go vote. Last year, the Senate Aging Committee did an extensive investigation into the spiraling cost increases of certain prescription drugs. It's been mentioned this morning. We looked at Turing, we looked at Valiant, and what we found was a pattern of certain, what I call hedge fund pharma companies, buying the rights to a drug and then overnight increasing the costs by as much as literally 5,000% in the case of Daraprim. And these were companies that played absolutely no role in the development of the pharmaceuticals. So there wasn't any investment in R&D that would justify that kind of increase. So I am particularly pleased that the chairman is holding this hearing today, because I think that we have a lot of work to do. One of the issues that really troubles me is the lack of transparency in the system. The MAC price is not what most people pay. Prices vary depending on what pharmaceutical benefit manager negotiated the cost. Prices vary according to, obviously, whether a generic can be substituted, but there's just a lack of transparency in the entire system. And I'd like to go across the panel and have each of you comment on how we can increase transparency into the pricing, because until we do that, it is going to be very difficult for us to get a handle on whether these cost increases are justified. Ms. Riley.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the work that you've done on issues that you raised, such as the ones with Daraprim, Turing, and Valiant Pharmaceuticals. We too share the concerns that you raised about the fact that companies can buy and essentially engage in regulatory arbitrage, knowing that the approval through the FDA may take years. There are a number of solutions that we've talked about as well that we think merit some consideration, whether the FDA can fast-track reviews of medicines to compete with these products, whether they can list on their website suppliers and names of companies that may be able to help in producing competing products. So we are thankful for your leadership on that issue and would welcome working with you on that. The issue of transparency, I think, is a very important one. You know, oftentimes when we hear the word transparency, it means different things to different people. Transparency is important, but it's important if it applies holistically. Oftentimes, the transparency legislation that we've seen wants to focus on one industry, the brand name pharmaceutical industry, and leave out the rest of the supply chain. As I mentioned in my testimony, brand name pharmaceuticals represent about half of what we spend on total drugs in this country. The rest is subsumed by generic manufacturers, as Chip mentioned, just over 20%, but the rest is as a result of supply chain, be it wholesalers, distributors, pharmacy benefit managers, payers, and hospitals. So if we're going to have a discussion on transparency, which we would welcome, we think it's important to have one that holistically involves the entire supply chain, because there are costs, as I mentioned before, in the hospital sector alone, where they are increasing their reimbursement 2.5 times over what they acquire a pharmaceutical product for. We definitely need to have more transparency into areas like that.
I see two of my members of the committee have returned, so rather than going down the line, I'm going to switch to another question that I want to make sure I get in. And Mr. Merritt, I'm going to direct it to you and Mr. Menahan. Last night, NBC Nightly News ran a story about an investigation which found that a wide variety of prescription drugs on certain insurance plans are actually cheaper when the consumer pays out of pocket. That makes no sense to me. We also learned that at least in some negotiations, in some contracts, there is a gag order that prevents pharmacists from telling patients that they would be better off paying out of pocket than using their health insurance. So I would like both of you to answer the question of how common is this practice and how can this occur? How can it occur that a prescription benefit manager whose very job is to negotiate prices, is negotiating a price that's actually higher than the consumer would pay out of pocket. Mr. Merritt.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and to answer your question, it's not something that should be going on in the marketplace. It's an outlier behavior. I'm not even sure if it's a PBM or an insurer behavior, but it's not something that we support. We think the person who goes to the pharmacy ought to pay the lesser amount if it's a cost sharing or the cost of the drug. So if there's a generic that costs $5 and it's a $20 copay, they should pay $5. They shouldn't pay that. So I agree that it's a practice that we don't support. It's an outlier practice and a practice that we hope goes away.
Mr. Monahan.
Thank you, Senator Collins. And first, I should say that I didn't handle an earlier question about rebates. We oppose rebates in all their forms. With regard to the question that you just asked, pharmacies are incredibly frustrated. Pharmacists are incredibly frustrated with their inability to help patients. Providing patient care shouldn't be this difficult. My members feel incredibly frustrated with their lack of connectivity, their lack of communication with plans. Essentially, they have no negotiating power, and they're sort of told what they have to do, and if they can take it or leave it. They can either be in a network or not, typically not, and if they're not, if they're in the network, they're told how to perform.
So is it an outlier, as
no,
Mr.
it's not an
Merritt
outlier.
says, or is this a common
It's common.
practice? Thank you. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the colleagues, the witnesses, for their good testimony. I want to ask a couple of questions, and Mr. Monahan, if I can start with you. At the front line with pharmacies and dealing with patients, commonly I hear, as I travel around Virginia, about how high prices affect financial decisions. You know, whether, as your last line was great, the most expensive drug is one that somebody doesn't get. Yeah. Often for a financial reason, or if they get, they don't use it correctly. 1 in 4 Americans who take prescription drugs report that they have difficulty affording them, and then these high costs lead to lack of access, and that disproportionately affects the most vulnerable people in my population. Just talk a little bit about your customers. How do you see this high price challenge affecting your customers?
Well, so on the front end, at the first purchase of a medication, oftentimes patients do have to make hard choices, and pharmacists are in a great position to help with those choices if given the latitude to do so. Oftentimes we spend our time chasing administrivia, when in fact we should be spending our time coaching patients on effective use of their medicines, which they so desperately need. Patients won't make lifestyle choices, won't be better nourished, won't increase their activity without long-term coaching and support. And when they face these major barriers on the front end, oftentimes they throw up their hands and say, I can't do it, it's too hard, and they go back to their old ways, and they don't manage their chronic disease. So at its core, these frontline decisions that patients have to make, and the limited resources and the lack of transparency that affects pharmacists' ability to understand the reasons behind why PBMs may say this drug is available, this one is not, and the conflict that occurs there when a physician says this is a drug I want for my patient, I think it's best for that patient. The pharmacist says, I'd like to give that to you, but it's going to cost you $500, and the patient says, I can't handle that, I give up. Pharmacists are really challenged with that. So to the degree that we know the reasons behind those formulary choices, we can be better advocates for our patients. To the degree that we can insert lower cost options in collaboration and with our physician colleagues, we can help our patients. But we need the time to do that, and we need the transparency and better understanding of the information behind those decisions that are often made far above us and without any transparency.
I would like the record to reflect that Mr. Menahan's use of the phrase administrivia suggests a new word that should be included in the Webster's Collegiate Dictionary in the coming year. I've never heard it, and I really like it. I'm going to use it, steal it, and say I thought of it. So my next question is for Mr.
It's yours, Senator.
My next question is for Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, your written testimony has a really nice thing that I love. Congress must act to support generic and biosimilars, and you give us 3 things, and I want to make sure I really get. There were 2. One, the CREATES Act, I understand. There were 2 I want to make sure I understand. I wonder if you could explain. First, repealing the misguided Medicaid penalty on generic drugs. describe what that penalty is and why it's misguided.
Sure, Senator. Thank you for the question. In the fall of 2015, as part of the budget agreement that I believe was reached in October of that year, a rebate penalty that has long been associated with the branded industry, right? In Medicaid, you pay a base level rebate if you're a branded product. And then if your price increases exceed medical inflation, there's an additional penalty over and above. That was instituted in the early 1990s through the OBRA process in an effort to constrain a monopolist company's ability to take price increases above and beyond the rate of inflation. Through weekend deliberations around that budget agreement, there was a decision made. There had been a bill introduced in the House and Senate that, quite frankly, had languished for several years. That was ultimately included in an effort because it was allegedly scored at saving about $1 billion over 10 years. The net effect of that provision, Senator, is that it actually applies in a commoditized market and can impact a generic manufacturer when they don't take a price increase. And so that penalty has now gone into effect beginning earlier this year, and we have heard from our members that in certain instances, some 40% of their generic portfolio is impacted by this additional penalty.
And this is
in instances when they did not take a price increase.
And it's a penalty that affects generics in a different way than branded.
Yes, Senator.
Mm-hmm. The second,
so we have an added additional expense back to the government that is not tied to when companies actually take a price increase. That's the net effect.
And then second, you want to ensure that biosimilar medicines have a level and competitive playing field in Medicare. Could you describe that as?
Sure, thank you. I think there's two components to that. One actually is that our members would actually like for biosimilars to be included in the 50% discount to the Medicare Part D coverage gap. So actually to make sure that there's not sort of an inverse incentive to make sure that a patient actually stays on the higher cost biologic if it's appropriate to be on the biosimilar, but we actually have to be exposed to the same 50% discount in the coverage gap. So that's something that we have supported, and we would urge Congress to consider that at the appropriate option. And then the last area with respect to that, and actually CMS, to their credit, is now looking at several of the reimbursement policies that originally came out relative to how they were going to treat biosimilars. We think there's more opportunity to encourage the marketplace, not distinguish the originator biologic and then group all biosimilars that have never been compared to each other in a separate J-code, and we're optimistic that perhaps CMS will continue that evaluation and come up with a different decision. But that's going to be critical to making sure that we have a more conducive environment for biosimilars moving forward.
Sure. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you. I think a lot about drugs, and I have to admit it turns my head. So I'm going to focus on insulin, and then I may come back to something else in a little bit, and I'm going to focus on it on two different areas. Ms. Riley, if we speak about some of our insulin products, they were increasing at 20% per year. Now, the Wall Street Journal had an article in 2016 about 2015, and at that point, they actually referred to the role of PBMs. But if I look prior to 2015, there were no rebates preachably being given to PBMs, but prices were going up anywhere from 10 to 23% per year. And this is towards the end of the monopoly. So presumably they've recouped their expense of new drug development, but costs are going up 20% per year, so that from, I think, 2010 to 2015, something goes from $114 to $228. As deductibles have grown, patients can't afford this. Now, you make a good case that we're investing in development, et cetera, but when costs are going up 20% per year on the tail end of a monopoly, presumably those costs have been recouped. Americans with diabetes and all Americans are upset. What do you say about that?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I think the diabetes marketplace, to your point, is often confusing. Today, it is, I would argue, one, if not the most competitive marketplaces. On average,
but can we go back to that specific period from, say, 2010 to 2015 or 2011, where people were basically price taking? They're getting 20% increases per year, even though presumably they had recouped their cost of investment prior to that.
Well, I would argue, Senator Cassidy, that rebates were occurring well before 2010. Today, the average rebate in the diabetes market.
In 2013 to 2014, quarter four, year to year, the price list for Novo Nordisk was 22% with a rebate of 1.2% increase. For Sanofi, it was 23% with a rebate change of 5.4%. Net price increase 20.8% and 26.4%. I'm not sure I'm seeing that. at least in that period up to through 2014.
And I'm not sure what the data that you're looking at, Senator Cassidy, but what I can tell you that today the rebates and discounts publicly reported average between 60 and 70%.
Okay, again, I'm not speaking of today. I'm speaking of that period in the early part of this decade.
Right.
Now, those drugs have now had a new competitor, and frankly, when there's new competitors, PBMs drive bigger rebates. And I have a question for Mr. Merritt about that in just a second. But if you're an American looking at their insulin price, believe me, there's a guy from Lafayette, Louisiana that texts me about 3 times a week talking about how his daughter cannot afford insulin and the price increase it's had, coupled with her high deductible premium. And he's a rock rib Republican, pro-business,
Right.
but he's about his daughter's diabetes.
Right.
So
well,
what do we say to her?
I would say a couple of things that are important that have happened. Prior to, I would say, 2012, most patients that had medicine, that took medicine, did not have a deductible for their medicine. When they showed up at the pharmacy counter in January, the price that they paid for their medicine was often a copay and a pretty modest one. For diabetes medicines, often $20. From 2012 to 2015, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of patients that today have a deductible.
So you're addressing, if I may, because I have limited time, you're addressing the fact that the individual may not have been seeing the price hit, but there's still price somebody's paying. It's either indirectly through the premium or directly through a copay. And so somebody's paying.
Well, I would argue, too, though, Senator Cassidy, when companies price their product, they're not just looking to get reimbursed for the prices that they spent on getting that individual product to market. Companies are investing in the next generation of cures and treatments. Those costs also have to be recouped. There's been many advancements in the space of insulin since they first began many years ago. And some of the newer insulins are longer acting. Patients can...
If I may say, though, just to counter that a little bit, there's been more of an emphasis upon raising prices on established drugs than upon new innovative drugs. And I think that's statistically. I don't have that statistic in front of me, but I've read that in the past.
Well, I would say last year price increases on all drugs was at 2.5%. So price increases have certainly moderated over the past few years. Well, that may have been the case several years ago. We are not seeing the kind of price increases today that we had years ago.
Let me go to Mr. Merritt. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. I apologize. Mr. Merritt, now I've learned to say what I've been told, not what I know, okay? But this Wall Street Journal article to which I refer with my questions to Ms. Riley point out that in 2015, actually, insulin prices did moderate. Prior to that, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, I wish my stocks were doing as well. But in 2015, it actually flattened, but the price increased dramatically because they had to pay high rebates to PBMs. A competitor had entered. The PBM could choose. And so to pay the rebate, they jacked up their price in order to pay for the rebate. Now, the woman, the CEO of Mylan came in to speak to me. She said, actually, their price was relatively flat. And then a competitor came in. PBMs came and said, wait a second, there's now a competitor. We'll only carry you if you give us a big rebate. They had to increase their price in order to pay the rebate. She said, it's paradoxical. In the world of PBMs, when there is no competitor, your prices are lower, and competition increases the price. Now, I've heard that from the CEO of Mylan and from the Wall Street Journal. Your thoughts regarding that?
Yeah, I would disagree with that. Let's remember Mylan raised the price of EpiPen 400% just because it felt like doing it. And
now they would counter and say, no, we had to do it because there's now a competitor, albeit on the market only for a short time. And we were told that they would not carry my EpiPen and they would carry the competitor unless we paid the rebate. That's when we increased it.
I don't think that happened. I think the reality is if they just lower the price, that would make it great too, because all we want is the lowest net cost.
So wait a second, on insulin, again, I'm looking at this Wall Street Journal article dated from October 2016, and they say that at that point, the net price going back to the manufacturer remained flat, even though the price increased dramatically, and they were paying the PBM for this with the delta between their net price and their list price. Are you disagreeing with that too?
Again, the simplest thing is for them just to lower their prices. Typically, a rebate goes up because the price goes up. If the price goes up, our clients are going to demand that we get more of a discount. That's just how it works. What we want is lower net costs. That can be done in a number of different ways, and to Chairman Alexander's point, you know, rebates are one way things can work, but the simplest thing would just be for prices to go down.
I'm way over, but I'll do it for a record and ask you to direct the response directly to the article from Wall Street Journal, which disagrees with that a little bit. I'm sorry for being way over. I apologize to my colleagues.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Senator Collins, and I want to add my thanks to Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Murray for holding this hearing, and thank you all to the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Riley, I hear from Granite Staters all the time who struggle to afford their medications, and they are so frustrated. Drug makers are reaping sky-high profits as patients choose between having their medicine or, for example, heating their homes. Choices they have to make too often because of the brazenly anti-competitive behavior that bad actors in the drug industry engage in. Most recently, Allergan, who makes the blockbuster dry eye drug Restasis. Restasis brought in sales of $1.5 billion last year alone, which is on average $4 million per day. Allergan has had a market monopoly on this multi-billion-dollar drug since its approval in 2002, and boy, is it working to keep it that way. On September 8th of this year, just 1 week before its patents were set to be subject of a hearing at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Allergan announced it had cut a deal with a Native American tribe in order to shield the Restasis patents from review by exploiting the doctrine of tribal sovereign immunity. In this outrageous first-of-its-kind deal, which just yesterday a federal district court judge called a ploy, Allergan assigned ownership of the Restasis patents over to the tribe. Then it basically licenses back the patents from the tribe and continues to sell the blockbuster drug. So Allergan is using tribal sovereign immunity to shield the Restasis patents from review, maintaining its market monopoly, preventing generic competition, and keeping prices and profits high. Meanwhile, patients who need Restasis are struggling to afford it. Allergan's behavior here is unacceptable, and if other drug companies follow its lead, the problem's only going to get worse. I'm very concerned about the potentially devastating implications of the deal for our entire patent system, for the delicate balance struck in the Hatch-Waxman Act, and most importantly, for patients' access to affordable drugs. So, Ms. Riley, your organization has a role to play here. In May of 2017, PhRMA approved new membership criteria to, and this is a quote, tackle the biggest challenges facing patients. And PhRMA expelled 22 member companies, which was seen as a response to public concern over the rising cost of prescription drugs and to remove bad actors. So, Ms. Riley, you are head of membership for PhRMA. What I want to know, yes or no, is whether you believe Allergan's actions are consistent with the mission of your organization.
First of all, thank you very much for the question. I want to make clear a few things. Today, our member companies are asked to defend their patents, not in one—
Ms. Riley, I have very limited time and another question to ask, so yes or no, is it consistent?
I believe the IPR process, which is in play here, is a process that needs significant reform. Our companies defend their patents.
But to exploit tribal sovereign immunity to avoid competition as opposed to dealing with the patent system, in my view, is unacceptable. I'm sorry, but because I have limited time, I'd like to move on to my next question, which is to Ms. Gallina. I want to discuss with you my serious concerns about the Washington Post 60 Minutes report this weekend on a bill from last year that your organization lobbied for aggressively. The DEA had the power to immediately stop distributors from supplying opioids and other prescription drugs to pill mills and other corrupt sources. But according to the DEA chief administrative law judge, last year's law makes it much harder for the DEA to use that power. Under the new law, the agency must provide substantial evidence that a distributor's actions makes death or serious bodily harm considerably more likely. And the DEA needs to do so before any witnesses are produced or any evidence is admitted at a hearing. As a result, the judge writes that the law appears to, and this is his quote, completely eliminate the DEA's ability to ever impose an immediate suspension. Yet, Ms. Gallina, your organization's spokesperson told the Washington Post, quote, to be clear, this law does not decrease DEA's enforcement against distributors. That's a direct contradiction from what the judge is saying, and it's his job to interpret the law. Doesn't that make your organization's statement pretty misleading?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The opioid epidemic in general is a very serious concern and a complex issue that we are also very concerned about as distributors. And we work with our supply chain partners daily to try and find solutions to that.
Ms. Gallimore, I understand that, but here's the point. The point is that your organization, which lobbied aggressively for this law last year, claimed that it does not decrease the DEA's enforcement against distributors. And the DEA chief administrative law judge says you're wrong, that the law completely eliminates the DEA's ability to take certain enforcement actions. It's his job to interpret the law. So is the judge wrong, or was your organization's statement misleading?
In that sense, I believe that the judge's statement was misleading, and I stand behind our organization's statement.
I'd suggest you read the judge's article, which has now been published, because what he points out, among other things, is that for all this time when there wasn't a statutory definition of immediate harm that constrained the DEA the way the bill that was passed last year does, over many, many years, the industry didn't challenge the DEA's actions because the DEA, very often, there's almost no case law on it. So I'd suggest you go read it, because there are a lot of us extraordinarily concerned.
We're a minute over.
And I thank you for your time, and thank you, Chairman Alexander.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Riley, the Congressional Research Service tells us the United States spends more for prescription drugs than other wealthy countries. In Europe, drug prices are set by governments, not by pharmaceutical companies. There's a recent study by McKinsey which indicated on average the difference between the price of one drug in the United States and the same drug in France, UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain was 50%. So U.S. consumers, by my reading, are subsidizing the world's research and development. I'm not the first one to divine this insight. Research and Development magazine tells us the U.S. accounted for 46% of global life sciences R&D, vast majority of that going to biopharma. So the challenge is even if Europeans or wealthy countries were to raise their prices and reduce the extent to which they're free riding, that wouldn't automatically lead to a decrease in prices here in the U.S. for our consumers. Instead, a company would be punished by their investors and by their stockholders for lightening the burden on rank-and-file Americans who are trying to obtain pharmaceuticals. So I guess my question is twofold. First part should be an easy sort of yes or no, as I would see it. Am I correct that foreign countries' pricing and reimbursement systems actually affect our prescription drug costs?
I would definitely say that the U.S. does bear the burden for the world in terms of supporting research and development. I think the numbers that you gave are much higher than I've seen in terms of the price differential between the United States and other countries. Okay. Oftentimes those rely on list prices, which are not the net price paid.
So we'll go back and look at the McKinsey study and see where you disagree with their premises and their findings. Maybe we could engage in a dialogue offline about that. The second part of the question is, since you've acknowledged there is an impact on these foreign reimbursement systems and foreign pricing on the price to U.S. consumers, how might we mitigate the extent to which Americans are innovators, our consumers are shouldering the burden of financing the world's medical innovation?
Well, one thing I think is important to make clear is we do have a different system in the United States. We reward innovation, companies that bring their products to market, and we pay more up front and we pay significantly less on the back end.
So you're giving me a lot of background. Are there strategies we might use as policymakers to change this dynamic or mitigate the extent to which we're shouldering the burden, like through free trade agreements?
Absolutely. Stronger trade agreements could go a long way to ensure that other companies or other countries are paying more of their fair share. I would note a comment that Mark said, which is with regards to the recent Hep C medicines. PBMs here on record said that patients here were paying less than what was being paid abroad, in part because of the considerable market consolidation we have in the PBM market, where you have many PBMs that are buying on behalf of more people than entire foreign countries in the EU.
Are there other strategies we might employ to reduce the price to consumers in the state of Indiana?
Well, I think, again, we have to look at what our insurance market system looks like today. I think oftentimes we treat pharmaceuticals very different than we treat other aspects of the healthcare system. Based on an individual's biology, if you need a medicine, you're being asked to pay significantly more out of pocket as opposed to if you needed to go into a hospital setting. So I think we do need to examine whether it's fair to say to a patient with rheumatoid arthritis, you need to pay 40% of the price of your medicine, and if I go in the hospital, I need to pay 4% of the cost.
So one possibility to lower prices and increase value, as I understand it, is the use of outcome-based contracts,
Correct.
Increasingly being piloted by pharmaceutical companies and insurers alike. Can you explain how these contracts work in summary fashion and their potential to lower drug costs for patients, and then perhaps elaborate on any policy initiatives we here might engage in that might be standing in the way of moving these pilots to scale?
Sure. Great question. I think there are a number of innovative arrangements that are being produced, the goal of which is to say, instead of purchasing medicines historically like we have, which is based on a volume basis, we'll pay for whatever we buy, a movement towards saying we will pay for those medicines at differential rates potentially, depending on if they meet the outcome that the payer and the pharmaceutical company can mutually agree to. There's lots of potential benefits of moving in this direction. First of all, our companies are putting our money where our mouth is. We may be getting paid less, or in some cases nothing, depending on if our medicine produces as we believe it should. So that's helpful for the healthcare system with the ability to lower costs, helpful for patients too, because the goal again is also that if patients aren't being helped by them, then their cost sharing should also be lowered by those medicines. They're in their infancy stage in part because there are government rules like the anti-kickback statute, price reporting, and communications with the FDA that need to be addressed to make these become much bigger than they are today.
Follow up with you and your organization, see if there's
Absolutely.
specific ways we might be helpful to empower our companies to make use of these contracts. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the high cost of prescription drugs is a huge problem. Let's talk about the best way to tackle this public health crisis. Ms. Riley, your association, which is called PhRMA, represents brand name drug companies, and you said in your testimony that, quote, the competitive market is the engine that drives the drug industry. So I take it you think that market solutions are the most effective way to deal with the rising price of drugs.
I do believe that markets lower costs, yes.
Good. I love markets, and I also believe in market-based solutions. So let's talk about one of the best market-based solutions, and that's competition. If the restrictions that prevent purchasers from importing the exact same drugs at lower prices from places like Canada were removed, we'd see some real competition and we'd see some lower prices. Another market solution is negotiation. If the federal government were allowed to negotiate more competitive drug prices for Medicare beneficiaries, then prices would come down. So, Ms. Riley, you've already said that PhRMA opposes importation of drugs from Canada. Let me ask about letting the federal government negotiate with drug companies over Medicare prices, these two market-based solutions.
Well, I would argue price controls are not a market-based solution. When foreign countries...
I'm sorry, I didn't ask about price controls. I asked about bringing in drugs that
bringing
would
in drugs
with
from other
here.
countries that price control their products is not a market-based way to get to drug prices.
So you would be in favor of drug importation from any place that's not doing what you call price control?
I would argue that almost every country outside of the U.S.
So there's no place that we could import
prices,
from that would satisfy
prices.
your requirements. How about the federal government competing and actually having some competition and saying we're going to negotiate prices?
I think there's often a fallacy that because the federal government is not setting prices in Medicare that there's not negotiation, and that couldn't be further from the truth. As we've seen in the Medicare Part D program, there's been robust negotiation. Rebates are over 35% on average in Part D.
So you're
Premiums
for,
have been low.
let me just stop you there. So I just want to make sure I understand the point of the group that you represent here and lobby for, and that is it that the federal government ought to be able to negotiate all drug prices?
No, we don't believe the federal government's in the best position. We have rapid market consolidation in the pharmacy benefit manager space that exerts significant pressure to the tune of over $100 billion in rebates last year.
I understand that you have other concerns, but you know, drug competition from Canada, price negotiation are market solutions. They're not government mandates, and I would have thought that if you believe in market solutions, you would have embraced them.
Well, I don't believe that price controls are market-based solutions, and I also think that you need to look at the downsides that happen in those countries, which is patients don't get the kind of access that they get to therapies here in the United States.
I realize that you can call it price controls, but this is a real question of whether or not there's any place else for consumers to go to purchase drugs, or whether or not the federal government can negotiate on a drug-by-drug basis every time taxpayers are picking up the ticket.
Well, the Congressional Budget Office has looked at this.
And the organizations who are testifying here today spent a combined total of $30 million lobbying Congress last year. Pharma, your organization, is responsible for almost 3/4 of that total, and a lot of that money that is spent lobbying Congress is to keep drug prices high. That's what improves profitability for your industry and the companies you represent. And here's what I think is really wrong about this. You talk about wanting market solutions, but your industry isn't based on competitive markets. It's based on totally artificial, taxpayer-granted monopolies. Companies invent new drugs, and then the government hands the companies the exclusive right to manufacture and sell those drugs at whatever prices they want for decades. So I just have a little bit of time left. But I want to ask, do you know the average length of a government-granted monopoly for top-selling drugs in this country?
10 to 12 years.
Yeah, 10 to 12 years. The law says 5.
No.
5 years of exclusivity, but drug companies game the system. According to a 2015 analysis by researchers at Harvard, companies end up with a monopoly that lasts a medium length of 12 and a half years.
Senator Warren, patents are 20 years long.
Mr. Chairman.
20 years. That is how long a pharmaceutical patent is. We also have 5 years of data exclusivity.
The law says 5 years of exclusivity on the basic drugs.
Absolutely.
And the average, you think the Harvard study, they don't know how to do it there to study how much money you're making off these things or how long you have exclusivity?
Senator Warren, I'm simply saying that companies have 5 years of data exclusivity. Immediately after that, a generic company can get to market. And let me tell you, they try very hard to get to market as soon as they can.
And you're saying that the drug companies don't game the system at all to expand their exclusivity to an average of 12 and a half years. It just happens.
Senator Warren, patents are 20 years long. Exclusivity is a completely different issue.
Try the story on someone else who's going to be willing to listen to it. You know, taxpayers watch. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You can finish your...
No. I just wanted to say taxpayers watch when we've granted exclusivity to these companies, and then they watch as the prices go up, and there's not a darn thing for taxpayers to do about it. This is just fundamentally wrong.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Galliner, I want to follow up just very quickly with the discussion that you were having with Senator Hassan regarding this latest news with the weakening of the DEA enforcement authorization. A big expose this weekend through 60 Minutes, Washington Post. You have a drug czar that is now effectively withdrawn from this position. The president himself is saying need to look into this and to investigate it. One of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle has already introduced legislation that would repeal it. There have been some that have suggested it needs to be modified. You've indicated to Senator Hassan that you think that the judge had misinterpreted, or you disagreed with the judge's interpretation, I believe. But do you think that that what was passed in 2016 is actually good and sound, or do you believe that, in fact, given what we know today, that it might need to be modified or amended in some way?
Thank you, Senator. First, let me say Senator Hatch and White House, who authored that bill in the Senate, worked very closely with the DEA to ensure that the bill did not inhibit the ability to take action against registrants. DEA did not oppose that bill. Also, regarding the ALJ's article, which was a draft, I understand, ALJs are not involved in issuing immediate suspension orders. They are recommended by DEA staff. They are issued by an administrator or a deputy administrator.
But do you think that something needs to be done to address what clearly has come out to be limitations within DEA's authority that we might need to address through legislation?
I think that it should be explored as to what DEA's limited actions were and their limited involvement with collaborating with industry and talking about defining the terms that registrants operate under. We have pages of questions that we have submitted to the agency over the years that have gone unanswered. This bill, from our understanding, is sound, and we supported it, but we are open to talking through those issues more closely with you and with other offices.
I do think that it is an issue that has really risen to perhaps a higher level, given what we are seeing around this country with regards to just the ease, the availability of these opioids that are just ravishing parts of our country. So this is something that needs to be continued and addressed. I've listened to the testimony from each of you, have read through your written comments, and I just have to express the frustration that I think the general public feels in just being so limited in their ability to understand why. All they know is that the most expensive part of their health care that they can see is what is going on with the cost of their prescription drugs. And then when we talk about, well, all we need is transparency, but if you look to try to understand it, you've got a manufacturer that sets a list price, but almost nobody pays that. You've got the PBMs that negotiate different prices. You've got the GPOs who might negotiate different prices. You've got one hospital that might charge something different than a hospital across the street. There may be rebates, there may be discounts, there may be other pricing things. There is no way that anyone can follow this. And for the average consumer, if you all are talking transparency, it doesn't mean anything to them. So I look to ways that we might be more transparent, that actually could translate to something. We put on the back of any product what the ingredients are and how that's allocated out. When Alaskans get a permanent fund dividend, it actually lists on that voucher, if you will, where all of the associated costs are attributed to. Are we crazy to think that we could be doing more with actually accounting for the cost so that the consumer could better understand and make it legible? Because right now, it's impossible to understand. And even those of us that are listening to you as supposed experts, it's all Greek. And we're not doing anything to help the consumer. So maybe it's a rhetorical question here, but I challenge you all to translate how the pricing mechanisms, who gets discounts, who doesn't, why it's fair for one hospital to charge something that the other one doesn't. In no other industry that I can think of do you have this latitude for a discrepancy in pricing and the ability to just set it and be done with it. I'm over my time, so perhaps if you can respond to me with some concrete examples of the ways that we can be more transparent, because I think that ultimately that can help us push down the cost. But right now, it's impossible to discern.
I'd like to ask the witnesses are welcome to respond to the senator in writing, with concrete examples. I think that'd be helpful to her and all of us. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just to Senator Murkowski's point, I got to be the chairman of Connecticut General Assembly's Health Committee when I was 29 years old because I was the only one who took the time to try to figure out how a drug was priced, what AWP and AMP meant, what the dispensing fee meant. It was the most opaque market that existed in our state's healthcare system, and to this day, I think there are only a couple state legislators in Connecticut who understand how a drug is priced either in the private market or through Medicaid, and it does behoove us when we talk about transparency to understand that if you just layer transparency on a pricing system today that has 1,000 different prices, it's really, really difficult. I just have one question because I know we got to sneak in Senator Baldwin and myself before the bell here, and it's for Ms. Riley, so I'll just prepare you for it. The Trump administration recently announced that it wants to expand association health plans and something called limited duration insurance plans. That was part of last week's executive order. The risk here is that you're now going to set up one system of care for healthy people who can get into those plans, which don't require you to price without respect to medical acuity, and one system for sick people who will then stay in the marketplaces under the Affordable Care Act where insurance plans can't discriminate. Your CEO said on television last week that the executive order was a good idea because we need to be trying everything that can lower costs for patients. But the fact of the matter is, when you review these short-term limited duration plans, by and large, they do not cover prescription drugs. If you look at the best-selling plans that are sold on e-health, they exclude pre-existing conditions, they exclude mental health, exclude substance abuse, they exclude prescription drugs and maternity expenses. And I looked up the best-selling plan in my home state, which is offered by National General Accident and Health, and it doesn't cover prescription drugs either. So why is pharma taking a position to support the executive order when, to the extent that these short-term duration plans become available to more and more Americans, it'll exclude the very product that you sell, in addition to all sorts of other coverages that people desperately need?
Thank you for the question. Let me offer 2 points. First of which is our CEO was asked that question before the executive order was actually released, so I would note that. The second, I think, some of the words that we heard coming out prior to the release of it had to do with how do we increase competition, how do we address some of the consolidation that's happening in the marketplace. I think those are principles that many people espouse. I think the details in terms of how this ultimately gets worked out, the devil is certainly in the details, and we will be looking anxiously as the various agencies look to implement that, because again, our goal is to ensuring patients have access to care. That is our primary goal.
And so let me just ask that more specifically. If the result of I understand what the rhetoric is when the president talks about his executive actions. They are often very different than the actual words in the EOs. If the result of this executive order is to dramatically expand access to limited duration plans, is that something that pharma would support?
Our goal, as I said before, is to ensure patients have access to therapies, including innovative medicines, because so many patients rely on them. So we will be looking in earnest as the agencies work on this to ensure that patients do continue to have access to medicines.
I would argue that now would be the time to weigh in and make your feelings known on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we've heard many competing reasons and even how it's very complex to know why drug prices are high and are increasing. So I continue to believe that we should start from the beginning of the story. I have a bipartisan bill with Senator McCain, and it's pretty simple. It would give us more information as policymakers by establishing basic transparency for drug companies when they increase the price of drugs. That's it. In fact, California just enacted, with bipartisan support, a new law similarly requiring transparency for drug price increases. While many changing factors contribute to a price that a patient pays, one factor has remained constant. We now see drug companies systematically increasing list prices of existing drugs every year. According to reports, in just the first quarter of 2017, there were 40 increases of drug prices, which is more than the first quarter of 2016. If, as we have heard today, the list price provides an inaccurate picture, then I'm not sure why we shouldn't just ask drug companies for information to help paint an accurate picture and to explain why we are seeing these prices increase as my bipartisan bill would do. Mr. David, you noted that in the last year, revenues for branded drugs have increased as a direct result of price increases. Can you please briefly elaborate on this and describe what your industry is seeing when it comes to list price increases? And I do want to ask another question, so please be brief, concise.
Sure. Thank you, Senator, for the question. Just to clarify, are you asking the question relative to the brands or to the generics? What we're seeing in the brand?
Branded drugs.
Yes.
You noted in your testimony.
Yes.
Yep.
So what we've actually seen, and this is an example of how different the markets operate, that while we're experiencing a period of unprecedented price deflation in the generics, where our actually year over year, the prescriptions are going up, the revenue's going down in our industry. That's opposite of what we're seeing on the branded side, where the prescriptions are actually going down and the revenue's continuing to go up. So there can be a whole host of economic reasons for that. One of them that we submitted in our testimony is we are seeing an increasing level, despite some of the communications about supporting generic and biosimilar competition, we are seeing an increased level of activity. Some of it was referenced earlier by Senator Hassan in her comments around, outsourcing IP to Native American tribes lately, of these types of behaviors that are making it more challenging for generics to get to the market.
Ms. Riley, like my colleagues have reflected in their comments and questions, I way too often hear concerns, stories from my constituents about the impact on drug price increases on their lives. Often these are tearful discussions because health and your ability to treat health conditions is deeply personal. I hear about the insulin list prices that have continued to increase since 2002, about top-selling drugs like Humira that have increased almost every year for 10 years, and about the more than 14 drugs for multiple sclerosis that have increased since 2004 to an annual average of about $83,000. A woman named Diane from Webster, Wisconsin, talked about a heartbreaking conversation she had with her husband earlier this year, where they decided that she would stop taking her MS medication after 23 years because of it reaching $90,000 a year. At the same time, reports have indicated that most of the big drug companies spend more on marketing than on research and development. A recent health affairs study of the 20 top-selling drugs found that earnings from charging high drug prices in the U.S. exceeded global spending in R&D. Ms. Riley, last year your trade association updated its membership criteria to stipulate that branded companies invest in certain amounts of global R&D spending per year to be eligible to join. Given this renewed commitment to R&D, do you support drug companies making their R&D spending and investments more transparent for the public, as my bipartisan bill would do, including when they increase the list price of an existing drug? Yes or no?
Absolutely. Research and development costs, and I think our companies by and large make that information public. It is an important part of what we do. I would take issue our companies spend significantly more on research and development than they do on marketing costs. With regard to transparency—
Did you disagree with the conclusions of the health affairs study?
I do, yes. With regards to transparency, again, I think a couple of things are important. One, it needs to be holistic and apply to the entire supply chain. As we talked about here today, we're half or slightly less than half of what we spend on brand name drugs. Lots of other folks in the supply chain also have a piece of this equation, and I think that needs to be explored.
I understand the arguments you've made. However, let's start at the beginning. Let's get transparency throughout, but let's start at the beginning, and the Fair Drug Pricing Act would be a good start in that direction.
I would just say list prices, too, as we've talked about here today, are not indicative of net prices and what are actually paid in the marketplace.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. I'm going to need to go vote, so I'm going to thank each of you for coming today. You've been excellent in helping us put a spotlight on drug prices. We have two senators one or two, who have questions to ask. I'm going to ask Senator Franken to chair in my absence, and he'll ask his questions, and then if other senators come back who have not asked their questions, he'll call on them, and then he'll adjourn the hearing. So thank you very much for coming. Senator Franken, thank you for chairing.
Thank you, and as you're leaving, I'd like to thank you and Senator Murray for calling this hearing, and also for the negotiations the important negotiations that you're involved in. So thank you. Just wanted to do that. Sorry, I haven't been here for the whole thing. I've had some other stuff to do, and I ran back so that I could do this, and so you'll excuse me. It's actually, I didn't run back. This is just such an exciting hearing. It seems like from your testimony and but mainly from your testimony, that like every one of you in some way or another is responsible for getting prices down. That's what it seemed like from your testimony. And I think Senator Young touched on this, but I want to try to go over it again for myself. The U.S. spends more on prescription drugs than any industrialized country, in part because drug prices are higher in the U.S. than in any other country. The drug industry pushes back and says that these price comparisons don't take into account the discounts that manufacturers give to insurers and other actors in the system. So to cut through that, I'd like to ask you some questions. Let's use the drug Advair, which is an asthma inhaler example. Where is that produced? It's produced in North Carolina. So it's a drug that's produced in the United States. Ms. Riley, what is the list price for Advair in the United States? And how does it compare to the costs in Canada, France, and Germany?
I honestly do not know the list price of Advair off the top of my head, Senator. Okay. I'd have to get back to you on that.
Sure. That's very understandable. I want to ask you the price of every drug. Let's see how you do. No. A Bloomberg News report from 2015 found that the list price for Advair was $309.60 in the United States. Accounting for, say, a 50% discount, then the price would be $154.80, which is still higher than the price in Canada, which in 2015 was $74.12. The price in Germany, which was $37.71. And the price in France, which was $34.52. Ms. Riley, why are prices so much higher in the United States for a drug produced in the United States? And this is true for drugs that are produced in the United States and not produced in the United States. Why are they so much higher? I think Americans really want to know this, and I think they want to know this because you guys talked about research. Americans pay for a lot of the basic research, right?
Yes.
Yeah, through NIH.
And our industry, yes.
But much of it, through the taxpayer, pays directly to the NIH to do the basic research. Most of the research you do is not, in your industry, is not basic research.
We do a fair amount of basic research.
You do a fair amount.
Yes.
Most of it is not basic research. And I'll give you the figures on that. We'll call that up in a second.
I'm aware.
These higher prices in the United States support high-level profits and some research and development costs, but we also pay these high prices because of the way our system is structured. The laws we set and the clout of the drug industry. For example, Congress passed a law that prohibits the federal government from negotiating with drug manufacturers for lower prices for Medicare, which is the single largest payer for prescription drugs. In those other countries, you have the government able to bargain with the pharmaceutical companies. All of you presented yourself as part of the piece that keeps the prices down. Why are the prices so much higher in this case, assuming a 50% discount from the list price? In a number of cases, twice as high, 4 times as high, Canada, France respectively, and more than 4 times as high in Germany. Why? Americans want to know why.
I think, and I'm happy to start, we do have a different system in the U.S. relative to other European countries. We actually compensate companies for the innovation and the value of the medicines that they bring. I would argue in many European countries, the prices are artificially depressed. They tend to also pay more when a medicine goes generic, and they use fewer generics. So in total, our systems are spending, if you compared on average how much we spend, yes, they probably do spend a little bit less. I would argue, though, that our country incentivizes new therapies and innovation to come to market. And then when that period of time, when a patent expires and exclusivity is gone, 90% of the market, 95% of the market shifts overnight to low-cost generics. In that system that we have, we are able to support a broader innovation ecosystem. You know, the fact that we have 90% generics here, and in most European countries it's 50 to 60%, in part because they don't incentivize their entry, they don't incentivize the dropping of price here. We do so in a way that additional resources are able to fuel the next generation of therapies for patients.
I would suggest it's very small comfort for the Minnesotans that I visit around my state who can't pay for their pharmaceuticals. And I would suggest to you that this is a longer discussion, but why Americans have to ask, why do Americans pay more, 2 times as much, 4 times as much for our pharmaceuticals, many of which we produce, many of which we've done the basic research for through the NIH? Why do we have to pay, why does the American consumer have to pay more than the Canadian consumer for the same drug, more than the German consumer, more than the French consumer?
Senator, I would also argue...
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, you know, there is a case here for the need for stronger trade agreements to ensure that other countries, particularly European countries, are paying more of their fair share.
So the answer is just to make them pay more?
No, I think them paying more would permit, you know, prices here to potentially fall. It would also permit more money to go back into research and development, which over time lowers the cost of therapies, both innovative therapies as well as generics.
Okay, anybody else on the panel care to comment?
Senator, if I could just add, just to reinforce a comment previously made, to say that all drugs are more expensive in the United States fails to recognize the distinction, Ms. Riley talked about it, between brands and generics. It is a carefully balanced, it historically has been a carefully balanced ecosystem created by Hatch-Waxman, where as a country we had made a decision in the 80s to actually make the investment for the ability to bring novel therapeutics to market sooner rather than later, and then ultimately get a utilization rate and lower cost generics than we have in the rest of the world. So to a question that was asked earlier, why shouldn't we consider importing generics from Canada, by example? They're more expensive in Canada, so I'm not sure why we would import something that's less expensive here to begin with.
I bet the idea, and I approve of being able to import, I bet you the idea would be to import the drugs that are cheaper.
Yes,
That's
sir.
just my guess about what consumers would do. And I don't know, I used to be in comedy, and I almost think that your answer there was a tad absurd, which is, of course, we're not saying we need the right to import the same drug that's more expensive in the other country. Do you understand kind of the absurdity of saying that?
Senator, my intention in saying that was to look at policy and understand that the markets operate fundamentally differently.
Okay,
the commoditized market in the United States is what drives generic prices lower than they are in other developed markets.
Okay.
That was my only point.
Thank you. But I do want to say that if you look at the whole universe of drug prices, we pay more. And we pay a lot more. And you're acknowledging that. That's what I'm talking about. I'll go to Senator Whitehouse.
Let me ask the panel to focus on a very specific issue, which is the question of monopoly. Okay? And let's set aside for a second the licensed monopoly that people get when their intellectual property is protected by a patent or a trademark, okay? Let's just set that aside. We're not talking about that particularly approved monopoly. We're talking about other kinds. Does everybody agree that we have seen circumstances recently in which a drug manufacturer has an effective monopoly with respect to one or more of their products? Does anybody dispute that phenomenon? Everybody agrees with that phenomenon? We've seen it, right? That's not complicated. Yes, everybody agrees. So let's say that you are a patient and you have taken a particular drug for many, many years, and it's not under any kind of trademark or patent protection, but somebody who's not even in the pharmaceutical industry, an investor, comes in and sees a monopoly, buys it, and jacks the price up by 500%. Just because they can. We know that that has happened also, don't we? Yes, from everybody. No dissent with that. Okay. So here's the problem that I have, which is that in that circumstance, the question then is, where do you go? How do people respond to that particular problem? And the thesis that I have is that in those circumstances, which we all admit are true, that there is a clear monopoly, and further, we see price manipulation consistent not with any market, but with monopoly power. My thesis is that there's no place for anybody to go. There is no entity in the United States government that has the authority to say, hold it, that's a monopoly. You are extracting monopoly rents, to use the economic term, and you got to knock it off. You may be able to get a lawsuit out of the Department of Justice for an antitrust or price-fixing type violation, but we haven't seen a lot of that. The FDA nibbles around the edges of this problem. It doesn't have authority to step in at that point. Shouldn't there be some place in government where it is clear once a monopoly exists, and there's no doubt about that, and it's clear that monopoly rent extraction is being done, nothing related to market pricing, in that narrow circumstance, shouldn't there be somebody able to act? And let's go right down the line here, starting with Mr. Menigan.
Thank you, Senator. We share your frustration. We often serve as uncompensated insurance agents for those with coverage who have to navigate complex insurance regs and coverage issues and co-payments and insurance. We want desperately to be part of the team that helps people navigate this system in a more effective way. And you concur that right now there's no place to go? That we have relatively few places, other than perhaps compassionate use programs that some companies provide, but not all companies provide that.
Mr. Merritt.
Yeah, it's frustrating. It is part of the marketplace. What we've seen is
part of a legitimate marketplace, though, right? Extracting monopoly rents isn't viewed by any economist as being legitimate economic behavior, is it?
Well, we didn't like it when Mr. Shkreli went and bought up Daraprim and sold it for thousands of % more, and I testified the same panel as him a year or two ago.
But other than
outrageous.
scolding him here in congressional committees,
well, here's what we did.
Nobody to say, no, you can't do that.
I'll tell you one thing that we did, and I'll let Lori talk about the legality, but just something we did in the marketplace. When Daraprim, the price was jacked up, he bought the drug for, was it $13.50 or something like that, and jacked it up to several $100s. If you looked at that from a price control perspective, maybe it'd be great if he just cut that in half to a few $100s. Or if you looked at, well, maybe he shouldn't charge more than it was originally, $13. What we did is we found a compound pharmacy out in San Diego that would do it for $1. And then we cut his drug off the formulary and said, here, everybody can have this drug for $1, but you can't have the Daraprim that's overpriced. So there are some things we can do in the marketplace, but that's not to say or imply that it's not a challenge. It just takes time to overcome.
My time is already out, so if I could just, if you have quick responses, I'll go to Mrs. Gallina.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. As you know, HDA members are unique in the supply chain, but we do support anything that supports increased competition in the marketplace.
Mr. Davis?
Yeah, Senator, I think what you've been characterizing is the equivalent of a de facto monopoly, right? Not one that's government licensed, but de facto, and it requires a lot of analysis before individuals like Mr. Shkreli decide to go in there. I do think moving forward there is a need to continue focus here. I do think that some of the things that the new FDA commissioner in the announcement of his drug competition action plan in legislation that this committee ensured was part of FDARA, which was a listing of Daraprim-like drugs. So there's more visibility and increasing the, in an effort to try and minimize the risk associated with more of those types of circumstances.
You agree with me that
provide
nobody presently has regulatory authority over exorbitant monopoly prices?
Correct. To the credit of the FDA commissioner, I think he's doing what he can within his remit.
Exactly.
But does he have all the authority to address that in and of himself? No.
Last of Ms. Riley.
I would say companies, like in the instance of Daraprim, took advantage of regulatory arbitrage to dramatically increase the price. I do think there is a lot that the FDA can do.
There was no direct regulator on the beat whose responsibility was to look for a clear de facto monopoly and address the excess price extraction.
Right. And to Chip's point, I think there's been a lot more.
I just want to make sure I heard you. Your answer.
Yeah,
right.
I would say in that particular case, and we've seen a handful of others that mimic the same pattern, is exactly right. I think the FDA is trying to do, but more could be done, and we've got lots of ideas on how you could address that.
Thanks for letting me go over, Chairman Franken.
Oh, I went way over. And I'm even going to ask one more question, just to Mr. Merritt, real quick. Pay for delay, because we're talking about monopolies. Pay for delay, drug company has a patent, and then a generic comes up, the patent runs out, generic has it, company has it, and they pay the generic not to bring it to market. What do you think of that practice?
Well, we oppose that practice. It is an interesting economic question because I've heard both sides on it. And I think well, Chip can address this better than me, but what generics would say is, well, gosh, it's so hard to break through a patent that at least if I can get a settlement, we'll try to get a generic to market, and there's some incentive to do that. But overall, our industry's on the other side of that issue.
Okay, thank you. The hearing record will remain open for 10 days. Members may submit additional information for the record within that time if they would like. The Help Committee will meet again tomorrow, October 18th at 9:30 a.m. for an executive session. Thank you all for being here today. The committee will stand adjourned.
It's not that far. It's on 6th between January.